we'll begin shortly. So welcome everybody. You have joined us in what I think is the 8th session of the day for the NENA 5th annual conference. And we are here to discuss property and the commons. So we are delighted to welcome two speakers, Gary Flomenhoft and Michael Murray. And just checking in with you both that Gary has opted to speak for 15 minutes, whereas Michael has actually got a 25-minute discussion allocated. I'm not, I hope that feels acceptable and equitable. That's how the program shows the division. And we have 50 minutes in total. So that does give us some time to have some feedback after Gary's paper. So unless you'd like to sort of add to my process, I'm going to suggest that we begin with Gary and I time you and give you a 3-minute warning at 12 minutes, and then we can take some questions, and then we can have Michael operate for what will amount to 25 minutes in total, including discussion. Does that sound?
Yeah, we talked about doing 5 minutes of questions after mine and then questions again after his.
Okay. All right. Great. So we'll begin. Now I may need to, or are you both able to share without me? Because you're in Brisbane, you can share directly, I think.
You need to enable the screen sharing, or somebody does.
or even for you. Okay, I'll do that right now. So you are in, well, I'll just admit these people coming in. Welcome to those who've just joined us. Now you are in Gary Birry country. Okay, so that's what I have to enable. Here we go. You are now the co-hosts and you can both share. And we've got Eleanor Glenn coming in, Madeline and Mabo.
Which you have to tell her which one it is.
From when we're Michelle Greenprints on this computer.
Oh, you're Michelle Greenprints. Oh, I did it. Sorry, I did it too. Yes, I thought it was Gary Birry country.
I'll accept the people in now, Bronwyn. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. So now I think that we have a setup that is workable for all.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's see.
Let me know when you're ready. I'll start.
Thank you, Gary. Welcome to NENA, and we're looking forward to it. Do start.
Okay, so this is a new presentation of this material, so I welcome your feedback. You get to be the guinea pigs my first time through. I heard Richard Dennis the other day talking about how the economy is invisible, but there's many things that are invisible that affect us greatly, gravity, for example. And J.P. Parker, I just heard her talk about explicit and implicit norms. And so I'm going to talk about the implicit norms, the invisible set of rules that we live by. And they're so invisible, they're like a matrix that we don't even see, which I call the Polanyi matrix. And I'll explain why later. I consider these economic rules are the operating system of society. Now, when your computer operating system is broken, you update the operating system, but we have not updated our operating system for several hundred years. So it's time for an update. So I'm going to talk about clean disruption and dirty continuity. If you are familiar with Tony Seba, he is the high priest of disruption. He talks about clean disruption and how disruptive technology always follows an S adoption curve. And he's like the guru of techno-utopia. We're going to replace all our dirty fossil fuels with renewable energy and electric vehicles, and it's going to be wonderful. And in fact, you can point to the history of the adoption of disruptive technology for all of the things that gadgets and technology that we love, that make our life so great, have all followed this S curve of adoption. And a perfect example is the price of automobiles. When Henry Ford invented the assembly line, the price of automobiles dropped drastically. And this was like one of the first good cases of disruption. Horses were replaced by cars in a matter of 20 years completely. So that's a really good early example. One you may be familiar with is Moore's law. And Gordon Moore, who started Intel, wrote a paper in 1965 that said that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubles every 2 years. And believe it or not, that law is still true. And that's what makes all our microelectronics so amazing. And as a result, you've got this huge drop in prices. 1 gigabyte of hard drive memory in 1956 was $10 million. And today it's 9 cents. If that gives you any idea. But if you apply this idea of Moore's law to, say, lithium ion batteries, it actually doesn't work because the price stagnated about 6 years ago. But if you actually apply Wright's law, it actually works quite well, which is that it's the economies of scale that matters. It's not time, it's cumulative production. And Kathy Woods from ARK Invest is the one who talks about this. And here, so if you apply Wright's law, it works perfectly for almost any new technology. And here's the graph of Wright's law applied to lithium batteries. And if Tony Seba is the high priest, well, Kathy Woods is the high priestess of disruptive innovation, and she advocates the same techno-utopia. So, and she has an investment company called ARK Invest, which invests only in disruptive technologies, such as the ones listed. And her sort of narrative is that these wonderful technologies are going to solve all our problems and make everybody rich. So that's the narrative of this sort of disruptive technology. And they were not the first. Actually, an economist named Joseph Schumpeter talked about creative destruction. And in order for this to be true, you have certain conditions. You have to have a competitive market for this product that's homogeneous, factor mobility, perfect information, and large number of firms. And for microelectronics, that's true. If you look on the right, you've got extremely competitive industry, and the companies are constantly providing new and better products and cheaper. So if you look at the supply curve, the supply is getting greater and cheaper all the time, which is driving the price down. So competition that's when the free enterprise works, is when competition drives the price down, and it makes us all better off because we can afford more stuff. And who is the Pied Piper of this disruptive innovation is none other than Elon Musk. He's the archetypical Silicon Valley billionaire who is the Pied Piper of this techno utopia. And personally, I like his vision. I used to work for NASA. I love high tech. I like his vision. He disrupts every technology he gets into. He's only got the Silicon Valley billionaires only have one little minor problem, and that's the San Francisco problem. And if you don't know, if you've never been there, Silicon Valley is right next to San Francisco. So here's what San Francisco looks like. So here's where the dirty continuity comes in. You've got the clean disruption, but the flip side of that is the dirty continuity. And as a Taoist, I see that these two things are connected, but somehow the people in Silicon Valley haven't figured out that the wealthier they get, the poorer the people get in San Francisco, because it drives the price of housing through the roof. And you could attribute it to the Western, if you want to get philosophical, the dualistic Manichaean philosophy that says we're good and they're bad.
I'm so sorry to stop you. We didn't start recording this. I'm just going to quickly start recording, and I do apologize. Resume. Keep going, Gary, and apologies.
Okay, good. So the reason I say this is dirty continuity is because this is nothing new. This is a continuation. Thomas Paine wrote about this in 1797. Henry George wandered the hills of San Francisco and said, it's the price of land that's causing all these problems. And even recently, Joseph Stiglitz has written about it. This has been known for hundreds of years. So then why doesn't anyone deal with it? Well, when you when you believe in disruptive innovation, then you have a philosophy of market fundamentalism. And this is the new religion. It's worldwide, it's global, and that's the Silicon Valley religion is market fundamentalism. They don't want to see these homeless people. In fact, they don't want to see them so badly that they get the police to clear all of their tents and their camps. And that's why the people in the right are sleeping on the sidewalk, because they bulldozed all of their tents. So that's the problem. So what is it? The problem is that when you have a fixed supply like land and you have increasing demand, it drives the price up. So competition for land drives the price up. Competition for products drives the price down. That's sort of basic economics. Somehow economists can't seem to figure that out. We have a runaway land prices in Australia. It's an economic emergency. We have now look at the price of microchips. It's going down. Now, can anyone see the difference between these two graphs? Well, for some reason, economists can't seem to figure this out. Here's the situation in Australia. Every major city, the price of land is going through the roof, and it's a global problem. It's the same thing everywhere. So this is a universal belief system that the market can solve everything. Why else does this happen? Well, you have this thing called the property lobby. Look at all these people who profit from the price of land going up: banks, developers, realtors, and also homeowners. There's 8 million homeowners in Australia. There's only 100,000 new home buyers. So that means the ratio is 80-1 for people who want prices to go up versus people who want prices to go down. And I think Upton Sinclair pretty much nailed the problem with his quote. It's difficult to get a person to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. I think that explains a lot. What does the federal government do? Well, they throw money at the problems. 5 years ago, it was $74 billion in subsidies. And they would be better off just building housing with this money instead of throwing it into the housing market. The conclusion is the market will never solve the housing problem. It's a market failure. So it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. But because of this market fundamentalism, they can't think about anything but the market as a solution, but it's a complete failure. Now, how did this happen? Well, it all started with the Enclosures. Everyone's heard of the Enclosure Acts in England. 21% of the land area, the common lands were taken away from the peasants. And they used to have access to common lands for subsistence and foraging and so forth. Because you cannot exist without land any more than you can exist without air or water. It's a necessity of life. It's not a commodity for speculation, or at least it shouldn't be. And there isn't an Aboriginal society in the world that ever treated land like a commodity. It was considered a commons to be shared, but this is beyond our thinking these days. Now, there was a guy who did a root cause analysis. He says, what's wrong with our economy? And he went back and he studied the transition from the feudal society to the market society. And he realized that what happened was when the market, I forgot to mention, when they enclosed the land and they threw the peasants off the land, they all had to go to cities to work in factories. What Dickens, this was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is what Dickens called the satanic mills. That's how bad the conditions were. So Polanyi took a look at this transition. He called it the Great Transformation from the feudal to the market society. And he said, we made 3 fatal errors. This is the best book of the 20th century. He wrote it in 1944. He said, you treated land, money, and labor as false commodities. These are false commodities because they're not produced in a factory. They are false commodities. And if you maintain these 3 false commodities, society will be destroyed. And sure enough, we see it happening. Due to globalization, Around 1975, wages stopped rising, at least in the United States and also other countries, because capital was able to flow all around the world and find the cheapest labor. So productivity has increased something like 8 times as fast as wages. But land hasn't slowed down in going up at all. So here's the situation. Does anyone have their salary going up faster than their cost of housing? No. And like, again, once again, this is not a new problem. People are squeezed between their low wages and the high cost of housing. So, you know, this has been known for a long time. So that's what happens when you treat land as a commodity rather than a necessity of life or a commons to be shared. The second problem is money as a commodity. Well, if you didn't know, the issuance of money has been outsourced to banks, private banks. 97% of the money supply is created by banks when they issue loans. And it turns out that 75 to 80% of bank loans are for real estate. Huh, surprise, surprise. So there's a strong connection between between the monetary system and the land system. So
Just
only
a couple of minutes to go.
Okay. So a dollar in 1913 is worth 3 cents today. So you have this constant monetary inflation. This is not a law of nature. This is just because of our monetary system. A large percentage of the cost of everything is interest, something like 40%. It automatically creates inequality because 10% of the top 10% of the people are creditors and the bottom 80% are debtors. So the monetary system by itself creates inequality, which has to be addressed. And this is a quote from Bucky Fuller, which Michelle also quoted: create a new model, don't fight the existing system. So what are some solutions? Land does not have to be a commodity. You can have non-market land. You can put it into land trusts. Money should be a public utility. Should not be a profit center for private banks. You can have public banks, community banks, 100% reserves. And labor, you can have worker-owned businesses and other types of situations where people are not just wage slaves selling their labor into labor markets. And I think it was Steve Liaros talked about gift economies, and that's what we had before market economies. So just to quickly cover these solutions, a CLT is non-market land. It's taken off the market forever, and so it's no longer subject to land speculation. We are starting a pilot project on Russell Island of a community land trust. Government does not have to borrow money from banks. They can issue credit interest-free, and it's been done several times in history. The colonies did it, President Lincoln did it, and there's lots of advocates out there. Positive money, modern monetary theory, basically issuing money without credit and without that debt associated with it. And I worked for 5 years on a public bank in Vermont. If you haven't read Web of Debt, it's one of the best books ever written on the subject. And you probably didn't know that The Wizard of Oz was a story about banking. And if you read that book, you'll understand why. And then finally, employee ownership. Another great book, The Divine Right of Capital. We've created this new corporate feudalism where all of the profits go to the shareholders who contribute basically nothing to the enterprise, and the rest of the stakeholders get very little. So that's another great book. To create an alternative system, we need a non-market land system, and we need a financing system for it. That would be community banks, public banks, could be even state banks, and we have to have this whole separate economy of non-market land, which is not subject to that massive speculation that goes on with market land. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Gary. That's a great tour of both problems, but you have left us with tendrils of hope in various directions, and we can take 5 minutes to explore perhaps either the hopeful side or the root cause analysis side. Of course, they're connected. Please feel free to turn on your cameras, particularly if you're able to contribute. You may also put questions in the chat if you like, and I'll pass them on. But it would be lovely to see something live in response if we can. I know it's been a long day. Here's something from Eleanor. She says she would love to hear more about the Moreton Bay CLT as a current example. Yeah, I understand it conceptually, but it's really interesting to think about what does it do, to people's kind of relationship to both the housing and the land, to kind of tell us more about how it works and how people kind of react to that shift.
So actually, Louise Crabtree in around 2008 organized a big conference for community land trusts and wrote a great manual on community land trusts for Australia. And I happen to live in the largest one in the world, which is in Burlington, Vermont. They have 3,000 properties. And it works a little differently here than it does over there. But the basic idea is that a not-for-profit community-based organization made up of local residents and advocates acquires land one way or the other, and then they either rent it out to people at below market rates, or they sell housing units to people that are placed on their land, and then they lease the land to the people, and they keep it affordable because the agreement is that the individual does not keep the profit when it's sold. It goes back to the organization, so it stays affordable forever. Now in Australia, because of the property laws, they have to use what's called shared equity, which means that the not-for-profit and the resident are the co-owners, the shared equity owners, which is also called tenants in common, because you cannot separate the owner of land and buildings. But they also use that in the US. So in that way, the not-for-profit owns at least 20%, and then the resident owns 80%. And they can get a regular bank loan and so forth. So it's essentially an agreement that any increase in land value goes back to the community rather than to the individual who happens to own it. However, you can gain equity, and it's the only type of affordable housing in Vermont where you can acquire ownership. All the rest of them are rentals. So you can become an owner, and you basically get back what you paid on the mortgage when you sell it, and we find another income qualified person who takes over. So all of the savings are passed on from one owner to the next. So it never becomes unaffordable. So that's essentially how it works. And we're building the model in Russell Island because we're self-funded and they had affordable land. And the problem we found is that there's no working examples in Australia. So we wanted to build a pilot project, and we're just about to start construction on our first unit within the next month or so. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, fantastic. Eleanor's quite excited to discover this, and it's interesting. This is what's so wonderful about the conference is that you think you're all sort of getting a sense of other things, experiments locally, but it takes someone based in Vermont to make it really transparent. But I think it's the City of Sydney actually recently funded Louise Crabtree, and I think Jason Twill was working with her. He's no longer based in Sydney, but to look at it quite seriously for trying to do some pilots in Sydney.
There's a lot of pilots being attempted at, but so far none of that have really gotten underway. And also my partner and I have a social enterprise, so if anybody wants to assistance with setting up a CLT, we're available.
Great, fantastic. I think I'm not seeing any more questions on the screen, and I think timing wise, this panel, well, we had the sort of 20 minutes for, we've gone slightly over that 20 minutes.
Yep, I'll pass it on.
In any case, so we'll pass on, but thank you, Gary. Terrific. And we are now turning to Michael.
He just has to share the screen.
Gary, if you can paste your contact details into the Zoom chat at some point, that would be lovely. There are interested people. Thanks, Kira.
Thank you. Just doing a few logistical things here.
Do we have any audience members sitting in the green print room in addition to the speakers?
Yes, 4.
Yes, we do. Yes.
Oh, okay. Welcome to you too. We feel mentally in community with you.
There we are.
Hi.
Okay, now.
So if you want to, have questions or something, I don't know if there's a mic, but
yeah,
Is that
that's
about good?
yeah.
it all depends on.
And
That
then-
is no, it's sort of spectral shadow plays.
No, that's not going to work,
That's
is
not
it?
gonna work, no.
Oh,
Well,
I
the
think-
other room had a camera up there. I don't really want to have
You
the.
want it facing you?
No.
Yes,
Yes, I want it facing me and the screen.
we were just
No,
trying to.
just make your screen, share your screen.
Yes, but then you only get up in the corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other room is better. But anyway, we'll have to go back to that way. That's okay.
Sorry, we're just doing a few logistical things. Will be 2 seconds.
That's okay. If anyone wants to send me a copy that I can share through my screen, that's another possibility. I don't know if Gary's still around, but while you're just fixing it, I often wonder who is the community that owns the land? Is it typically the city holds onto it, or could it actually be invested in an actual community? I think I've heard of it being used for racial justice in some instances.
No, that's him before.
What was your question? That whether
Well-
we can own the land?
Who actually owns the community bit? So,
The not-for-profit organization will.
Oh,
own
right.
the land.
Oh, it is there. So yeah.
So that's quite a, that must be quite
Gotcha.
a tricky road to trace as to
There we
who's
go.
the not-for-profit and
Yeah.
how's it governed and so on. Here we go. Michael Murray, thank you. Peak Property,
Hey, hi.
delighted to
So-
welcome you.
I'm just gonna.
And yes,
That can't go.
it haunts all of our
You want to just do it?
conversations,
Yeah, we have
especially.
to. Yeah, no, the bigger. Yeah,
bigger.
put that back. That's fine. That's
That's
fine.
okay.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Hi,
You
Michael.
here? Hi. Sorry about that. So look, my name is Michael Murray. I've been interested in property all my life. I was an architecture student, then I started building and buying and selling, and I've had a career as a filmmaker, a documentary producer, and I've made films about successful eco-villages around the world, and also ferals living in the forest in the northern New South Wales. And for the last 20 years, I've been a buyer's agent in Byron Bay, and that's probably the cutting edge of property in Australia at the moment. And it's been heartbreaking to see what's been going on with friends and associates in Byron Bay with what's been happening in the property market and the rental market, and the serious repercussions it's been having for people's lifestyles and families. So what I've done here is I wanted to tell a story about property and how we got to where we are today, which I call peak property, and how we can maybe get off that property ladder and find new ways to actually house people equitably and safely. So
Oh,
do we have to do that one?
Oh yeah, you can do it that
Okay.
way. Yeah.
Okay, so a millennia ago, Homo sapiens wandered the planet, wandered the land, probably having no idea of what land registration or capital gains or land tax meant, of course, and hunter-gathering and living quite happily, apparently, according to the book Homo Sapiens. Now, that really changed about 10,000 years BC when we had agriculture and the domestication of animals. And that happened when an ice age at the time retreated, and there was more usable land, and people found it was more accessible to live stable for a while, grow crops and tend animals. Now, between that, there was the time of conquest and empire. where land and tribes became more consolidated in one place. And what a lot of people don't realize is that when a king or a monarch or a lord wanted to stabilize their land, they had to keep a standing army. And what was the best way to keep and feed a standing army? Usually was to invade your neighbor. And that's how the whole idea of feudalism came in place, where peasants and serfs were occupied in the land and paid liege to their lord, and they were more or less taken care of in servitude, but it was relatively stable. Now, what happened in the mid-1700s was the Enclosure Act, which meant that many commons, lands of the commons that were used by the serfs as common land for foraging and to subsistence living, was deemed to be no longer efficient. And these people were moved off, and the enclosures happened between the mid-1700s and the mid-1800s. And coincidentally, this was the time when many people were, of course, the colonies were happening, and there were people stealing a loaf of bread and were shipped off to places like Australia. Also at the same time, it was the Industrial Revolution was happening, and many of these people forced off the lands out of the enclosures, went to live in the went to work and suffer in the factories making products. We come back to Australia now, and this gentleman on the screen is called Sir Richard Torrens, and he was in Adelaide, and he became known as the Torrens Title Act. And this is an administrative process developed by Richard Torrens in Adelaide in the mid-1800s of a way to administrate the sale and record keeping of land. So this is Australian innovation, and now it's gone around the world, and the various forms of Torrens title has become very common throughout the land. For a while, I've loaned a piece of land in Sri Lanka, and that was village title. And let me tell you, it's very interesting having village title land. Now we jump forward to the 60s, 70s, and we come to what's known as the Battle of the Commons. Now on the left is a gentleman called Garrett Hardon. He wrote a paper in the late 60s called The Tragedy of the Commons. This was a paper that said that with overpopulation, we were going to see the downfall of the commons, and the common access to infrastructure and goods was going to fall apart mainly through overpopulation. Now, unfortunately, his thesis and his paper was taken on board quite vehemently by the people who were pushing neoliberal economics at the time. And of course, the idea that the commons is no longer functional, no longer efficient, very similar to the enclosures of the mid-17th century. It was the idea that private ownership, selling off of public assets was the best way forward. But she was countered by the lady on the right, Eleanor Ostrom, who wrote a counter-argument called Governing the Commons. She went around the world and studied all the different, excuse me, I'm no longer on the screen.
Oh, we can see you.
We can see you?
Yeah.
Oh,
Nothing's
okay.
changed for us.
Okay, good. I'll push on. That's it.
Yeah, just see if you can. Oh, you're there.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Sorry. So what happened was that Eleanor Ostrom, she won a Nobel Prize. Her thesis countered Hardon, saying that there is ways to govern the commons, that public assets can be kept in if certain procedures are followed. She wrote a book, and she has the 8 precepts of governing the commons. So one more Australian process. In 1992, Eddie Mabo won land rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands people. Great, everybody is very happy with that. But we have to remember that the way that this happened, the reversal of terra nullius, in some ways cemented the concept of private land ownership as opposed to the idea of the commons and public land ownership, because Eddie Mabo was able to prove that his hereditary
title of a garden plot on the North Cape, Cape York, was able to be proved, therefore annulling terra nullius, and land rights soon followed. This was great, but we have to remember that this was a opposite to what we was thinking theoretically around community-owned land. So here we are now today. So at the top of the property ladder at peak property, where do we go to from here? What are some of the suggestions? There's even been quite a few discussions today at this conference, which have been great. And there seems to be very disparate way forward. My proposal, it's not my proposal, but the idea that I'm really feeling is worthy of consideration is that there is a middle path through the idea of social housing and private property. On the left, we have social housing, which is, in a previous discussion this morning, we heard somebody saying we need X amount of dollars to increase private social housing, where I think if we're going to wait around for governments to build social housing, we're going to be just waiting years before they make a decision, and then years in the proposal of it. So on the right, we have private property. There's private property, commercial and residential real estate in Australia at the moment is about $8 trillion. And that's the biggest asset class we have. $3 trillion is inside the superannuation funds. So it gives you an idea of the kind of assets that the government is trying to protect. So if we look at what I call a mixed market model, there's a slide missing. I had another slide here, which had a list of 20 different mixed market models going from, no, it's my fault.
Is it?
Yeah, there was a slide showing a whole list of different mixed market models going from co-housing CLT, which was to give you an idea of the different models that were out there. And I think at least a half a dozen of them are going to slowly slip through and become more mainstream. In the words of the science fiction writer, William Gibson, who said that the future is already here, it's just badly distributed. So what we're seeing now is a small panorama of different mixed market models where you have a combination of commons housing, social housing, also with private equity involved. Because I think if you start to attack private property, as was pointed out by the previous speaker, 80 people to 1 own property, then the government that is in power, when private property or residential real estate starts to decline, that government is not going to last long. In fact, they will be voted out almost immediately. So we have to get over this idea that the government is going to come to the rescue, either with social housing or with the decline of private property. So where can we go? So social housing, 4% in Australia at the moment. In Byron Shire, where I am, there's 1.8% of houses is social housing. In Byron Shire, there are people sleeping in cars, sleeping in tents, and having to move away from the area after they've been there many years. And then this is me in the garden of my house in Byron Shire, just outside between Byron Bay and Mullumbimby. A few years ago, Byron Shire's median house price overcame Sydney and became the most expensive real estate in Australia, and probably the third most expensive real estate in the world after Vancouver and Hong Kong. That house there is probably slightly similar to a median price house. The median price in the last 18 months has gone from 1.5 million to $2.7 million, almost doubling. I made more money living in my house last year by far than I did working. Do you think that's fair? I'm a baby boomer. You can hate me if you want. So this is one model also in Byron Bay of mixed market. This is a property in Byron. Unfortunately, these are no longer affordable because it's still tied to the speculative housing market. When these places went on, you can see the downstairs unit is a is an office or creative industry home office. Upstairs is a 2-bedroom unit. These places went on the market for around 700, 750, almost affordable. Now they're well over 1.5. This is a model that I'm trying to promote as a concept where if you can take some of the land, because there's ridiculous even thinking that we're going to build affordable property in a place like Byron Shire or almost anywhere along the eastern coast of Australia, if we have to buy the land off on the speculative market and then try and build affordable housing from there, it's just not going to work. Oh, there's my model. It was in the wrong place. So that's the list of 20 active mixed market models that are happening at the moment. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through them all, but many are happening now. And I think at least a few of them will become more mainstream and more acceptable as we go forward. And it'll be interesting to watch which ones. Watch this space. The one that's most easiest to explain of a mixed market model is this one, the manufactured home estate, or what's called a land lease community. Now, this already exists in the market, and you usually think of them as aged care, senior living, or holiday homes, where these structures, 60, 80 square meters, are owned by the owner. The dwelling is owned, so people have equity in the model, but then the land is owned by an entity, either a council or a private firm, or some kind of a developer, and then that land is leased back. Now, there's ways to build this. We can roll this out almost immediately now. We just, at the moment, they're only kind of prescribed into aged care or holiday villas, but these could be made into housing estates quite quickly, either on private or council land. Sorry about this clicker. Now, this is another model. This is a tiny house village in Melbourne. This is just outside the Footscray railway station. This is land owned by the council. And they knew that it wasn't going to be 5 years until their land was going to be developed. So they did what's called a meantime development. Now, although I'm not a huge fan of tiny homes myself, although there are many people building tiny homes and wanting to live in them. And then there's many people who are supplying tiny homes, but where there's a bottleneck in the system is that councils or LGAs or local authorities are just having no way to allow this to proceed quickly because the legislation is just not there to do it. Footscray Council and a few others, I think Gosford and Grafton even as well, are looking at it seriously and building small villages plugged into the system. But in theory, something like this, a tiny house village or a small portable studio village, can be established very quickly and very easily with the technology and the infrastructure is there now that you don't even need a DA. You can move these dwellings onto any site with solar power on grey water management systems above ground and compost toilets. But the mechanization, the mechanics of doing it through the LGAs and legislation just won't allow it to happen. This is a model that I find really interesting that's happening around the world, but not so much here in Australia. And it's not really a model for home ownership, but this is an indication of what's happening in the future with the demand from digital nomads. Now, digital nomads are a bit outside of the demographic that I'm usually pitching to, because the demographic that what we've got to supply housing to is the people that fit between social housing and speculative housing models. So if you don't have a couple of $100,000 for a deposit and more than a variable income, you can't get into the speculative home market. But if you have a couple of $100,000 and a median income, how can you buy and live in a sustainable house? I'm seeing nodding up the back, that's great. How do you get into the market? There's no model there that fits for you. So I'm saying the mixed market model is something, and people like the digital nomads are the ones that are creating this kind of model, because around the world in places like Bali and Ibiza, Sri Lanka, they're building these houses for people who get on good wages, you know, tech workers, online online startup people running businesses from a laptop. They just want to go and travel somewhere, be in a place for 3 months. As long as you've got good internet, a juice bar, bean bags, ping pong table in a community area, they're happy and they're going to pay good money rental and even buy units like that. But mostly millennials don't want to get hooked into this crazy real estate market, and who should blame them? But they are creating themselves a model of good possibilities of living without a huge footprint, and we should take notice of that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a couple of times about what's happening around the world about community buyback of property. And this is happening in quite a few places, not necessarily Australia, and certainly not with this government. But this is an apartment block in Berlin. Berlin, of course, has had a fascinating housing story over the years after the wall came down, and through the 90s and early 2000s, it was a paradise for young creators and artists, and it became a really fantastic place to live because rental was easily accessible and cheap. Unfortunately, a few years ago, the Berlin government shot themselves in the foot and had an economic disaster, and they sold off a lot of their publicly owned property. Now, the agitators and the people in Berlin who want to recreate what happened a few years ago before the speculators and developers came in are demanding that the government buys back this apartment block. In the legislation in Berlin, they have what's called expropriation clause, where property is allowed to be purchased back from either a private owner or the government for the public good. Now, this has been done a few times, and unfortunately in the past it was done in not such glorious ways. Of course, the expropriation clause was used by the Nazis during the war to take property off the Jews. But watch this space with Berlin. They've been moving quite strongly to get that apartment block back. We move now to Scotland. Scotland's got many, many circumstances and situations where they are buying back land for the community and are doing quite well. The island that I've got circled there is an island called Ulva, and it was purchased. It had couple of hundred people living in it, and then it went down to about 20, and they purchased the whole island and are going to give it back to the community. It's being repopulated at the moment, and it's working quite well. The interesting connection it has to Australia is that the Macquarie Bank funded the buyback quite a bit because Lachlan Macquarie, one of our early governors, was born there, and they have an emotional connection to that island. So community buyback of public property can happen, does happen. It's happening around the world. It can happen here as well. So why isn't this working more? Why aren't we doing more productivity around this? There's a couple of reasons. One of them is actually we don't get along. In Byron Bay, where I live, I deal, and in my work as a buyer's agent, I deal a lot with multiple occupancies, community titles, and co-housing and things, experimental models that have worked, and I lived on them myself. I think there's a lot of work still to be done before we can get back to harmonious commons usage, until people start to do ways of working harmoniously together. My theory is that whenever you get a group of people, 10% of those people are people you're probably never going to want to hang out with. So how do you solve that problem? I don't know. This is a work in progress. The other problem we've got when creating these models is Nimby-ism. Of course, when you say, oh, we're going to have a co-housing or social housing, or we're going to have a community housing project in this street down the road, you watch the residents have a fit. They're just not going to like that. They're not going to like that. They're saying that, oh, we're protecting our property, we're connecting our community. Actually, the reality is they're protecting their real estate values. So what happens when these things happen is that you have the councillors and the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are usually the neighbours and the housed people, wealthy people who have the voice, and the people who are potential future residents of these properties are not spoken for. They're not in the game. The future residents there, whenever there's a discussion or a debate about how we can build affordable housing, are not in the room. These people need to have more of a voice. So if I was going to leave you with anything, how am I going for time? Do I have to hurry up or? Anyway, I'll finish and take some questions because.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. The 5 minutes for questions would start right now. Yeah.
Okay, great. So 10 seconds on this. What are we going to do? Imagine and innovate. That's a way where we can even think of new housing models and look at these housing models that are already out there and make the developers and the decision makers in councils know that this is something that you want and the money and the developers will come through. Remember, the statement I'm trying to make is that there is a middle way through speculative housing model and social housing where there's a combination of social housing and speculative housing combined. So we have to imagine and innovate, then integrate. You can't do this unless you're ready to be harmonious with your neighbor and get along together, because those community social spaces will require that you're going to rub up against each other. Are you ready to do that? And again, agitate. The main decision and educational thing I'm trying to do here is apply pressure where it's actually going to have some outcome. And the outcome is if you become familiar with planning and policy laws and regulations around what can be approved, you're going to have more chance of getting it done instead of coming up and saying, oh, we want more social housing. We want property prices to come down so it's more affordable. This is not realistic. Being realistic is understanding how the policy and planning rules work and make these mixed market models more accessible and usable. And that's about it.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Perhaps if you could stop sharing, then we'll all pop up as at least boxes and possibly faces. I'm really enjoying it, just as a comment to hear a particular sequence. I feel like I'm hearing more and more through the conference, which is a sort of critical analysis of what's wrong, and then an articulation of certain solutions. But then on top of that, some of this identification of key barriers to that, and I think starting some sense of, pushing back against those barriers to make it more possible is a great way forward. JP's mentioned the pro-social framework in the chat as one quite, in fact, was it co-founded by an Australian, JP? I know there's some Australians involved.
Yes, Paul Atkins is Australian. He's in Canberra.
Incorporating that into, it's really remarkable how little we get educated to get along during our education. Informal ways to be taught to do that, to get along in groups. And that thing that came up that was mentioned by Gary, the Community Land Trust Manual that Louise Crabtree produced, is actually a great starting resource for your second point, Michael, about getting to grips with the detail of the policy and planning laws that you have to grapple with in order to set up these things. But let me open it up. I'm just checking on the chat if there's anyone. Please, anyone, do turn on your chat camera or just speak into the microphone.
We've got a question in the room.
Yes,
yep, we've got.
please. Thank you. Hello, room.
I'm kind of quite interested in theories about the commons. As an intellectual property scholar, we've often borrowed heavily from the property language in relation to the both for rights and for the commons in terms of conceiving of new areas. I just wonder, in light of some of the discussions at the moment in terms of the commons, whether you thought about that kind of hyper private property model not only happening in relation to physical property, but also in terms of various kinds of intangible property, patents, copyright, trademarks.
Yeah, I think it does cross over a lot, that the commons, as far as shared IP, I think it's all tied in together. And I think it's an expanding concept, the reinvention or the reappreciation of the commons is kind of the essence of what I'm trying to talk about and educate, is that we can come off this ladder where private property is king and property rights trump all others, which is what's happening classically in the debate at the moment around Byron Shire, especially around Airbnb, where private property rights trumps neighborhoods. Now, that's a very nuanced discussion. I don't want to go down that, but there is, I think, that whole avenue where I think where we are with the Industrial Revolution and intellectual property and patents, and has served us probably quite well to get where we are now. It's probably why I use the term peak property, is that it's possibly now time to get off that peak and start to look at more communal assets and sharing of entity, not only property, but everything like that.
We found it difficult to establish commons models in intellectual property. I was just at the Crowd Commons Summit, and it was the 20th anniversary, and it has achieved many things, but it still is very alternative and marginal to the dominant systems.
Well, I think it's time that we reappreciate Eleanor Ostrom and the concept of governance of the commons, instead of allowing the hijacking of the tragedy of the commons by in the 70s with Thatcherism and Reaganism and neoliberal economics, which basically took this concept that private ownership is the most efficient way of managing. And look, I'm working property. I'm not, and I've seen the negative side of public ownership and community ownership. And we've got some seriously dysfunctional tenants in common properties in the hinterland around Nimbin and the Northern Rivers, because people don't get on and people can't harness community decision-making. Is a very difficult process.
Michael Heller from Columbia Law School talks about the tragedy of the anti-commons.
Oh, yeah.
He has a book called The Gridlock Economy, where there's so many fragmented rights that it's very difficult to...
The right in politics are very good at messaging and capturing the mainstream. The left are very diffused, dispirited, and disconnected. And I think that's probably the essence of what we're what I'm possibly saying here is get unified and get kind of zero focused on what is going to work. Because if everybody's going, oh, I want more social housing, oh, we got to bring that property. There's so, even at this conference today, I've heard probably 15 different concepts. So it's the battle of the concepts. Yes. All good. Any question on the screen?
There's no more in the street. I don't know what, I couldn't quite hear that one. But we are actually at time. It's right on 5:30, and there's another panel. So I am going to thank both the speakers. I just a quick comment. It's true that it's marginal in contemporary culture, but one of the things that gives me, more and more feels to me to land more and more is, if you think of the big paradigm shifts that have happened in history, they often went back quite far. And it's, like, I don't know, the Renaissance people went back to the Greek culture and so on. And the diggers, who were really radical Democrats in the British Civil War, went back to Magna Carta and so on. So people were able to mobilize quite disparate, distant, invisible things and revive them out of history and make them attractive again. And then that led to much more serious transformation than sort of incremental shifts. So that's my plug for It's Not Impossible. The speakers, if you could put your details into Zoom, there's interest and enthusiasm for that from the audience. Thank you to both of you for very thought-provoking presentations, Michael and Gary, and thank you to all of you for hanging in there. There's yet another session to come, and I will hand over to somebody else to chair that. And first I will stop the recording. And thank you. Bye.